Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we have with us Professor Charlie Kurth, who is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University and the author of two books, Emotion, which was released this year, and The Anxious Mind, an investigation into the varieties and virtues of anxiety, which released in 2018. It's a pleasure speaking to you with you, Professor Kurth. How are you today?
I'm doing well, and I'm delighted to have this invitation and opportunity to talk with you.
Of course, thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussion, I just kind of introduced you a little bit, but for people who may not know a lot about you and kind of your story, could you please provide a little bit more information on who you are, your background, your relationship to philosophy, like what it means to you, and then could you also talk a little bit about why you came back to school to study philosophy formally after working 3 years in finance in New York City?
Yeah, sure. So when I was an undergrad in college, I studied political science and economics. And in my senior year, I took a handful of classes in philosophy, and I was like, "Wow, that's kind of cool stuff." But at that time, I had a job lined up to go work in investment banking, and so I went and did that, and did it for 3 years. But I found after about a couple of years that I was just bored, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and it seemed like there was like a philosophy shaped hole that I was looking for in terms of like the intellectual rigor and engagement that I so enjoyed in the classes I took in my senior year in college, and so I quit my job, took a bet that philosophy was what I wanted to do, and enrolled in applied and enrolled in a master's program, and then from there moved into a PhD program, and then lo and behold, here I am working in philosophy. My interests are in ethics, in moral psychology, and the philosophy of mind. And what I'm really sort of most interested in my current research is trying to understand like what are our emotions and how do they shape us for the better and for the worse. So questions about how the emotions we feel, anxiety, disgust, pride, shame, uh, make us better people or and contribute to our virtue, or can undermine what we're trying to do as individuals or as groups. Yeah.
I think those are definitely like really cool questions to ask, especially because like we heard so much about like the pandemic having a big impact on on people in general. So like these questions are pretty prevalent right now, and they have been for a very long time. But like now getting into like kind of like I guess the nitty gritty of like the philosophy of emotions and anxiety, you mentioned in your recent book, Emotion, that emotions are quote cool. But what exactly are emotions? Like what do they, does everyone have emotions? Are they neurobiologically constructed or philosophically founded? And is there like an evolutionary reason to why emotions have consistently developed over generations?
Yeah, I definitely think emotions are cool because they just engage. They're a window on to so many sort of deep and interesting questions in philosophy, from the history of philosophy to the philosophy of science, to epistemology, to various questions in ethics and value theory. Um, and that's part of what attracts me to it. And so you asked this seemingly really simple question, but turns out to be like super hard. What are emotions? And I think that the term emotion is kind of like the term sandwich. It's this label we have, and we use it to sort of refer to a really motley collection of things. Like, so sandwich is going to cover the tuna melt to the Big Mac to the classic ham and cheese sandwiches that we find, right? And what that means when we translate this to the land of emotions is that there really might not be a single thing that is emotions as we talk about it, at least in our everyday sort of conversations. And so I think some of the things that we call emotions, so maybe things like joy or fear or anxiety, disgust. These are going to be things, mental states, physiological states that are sort of evolutionarily hardwired in us. So they're things that we should be able to see some kind of analog in non-human animals, maybe even, like chimps or macaques, maybe even, household pets like my dog Jake, who's wandering around here someplace. But then other things like maybe grief or nostalgia, those aren't going to be like hardwired in us. They're going to be things that are shaped more by our culture and our individual experiences, fumbling around in the world, and sort of to see how that might make some sense. Like my dog can feel fear when there's like a thunderstorm, like there was last night, but he's not nostalgic about the good old puppy days, right? And so like we get this sense for like some of these emotions might be sort of distinctly cultural, and while other things are hardwired. And there's probably more gradations in between, but maybe that's a start for a way to think about, or at least how I'm thinking about emotions.
Definitely, that makes sense. And that example was really funny, like about the dog. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more like complicated processes that happen with humans compared to non-humans. But I want to know like a little bit more about like people. So there's these people with alexithymia, I think it's pronounced, which is like when people have problems in terms like in interpreting emotions and just having emotions in general. So how do they feel emotions, and how does philosophy kind of interpret that case? Because the way that I'm treating this now is it almost seems like there is an entanglement with the neurobiological and the philosophical when you're interpreting these things. So how does that distinction work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and a hard one. So um, I think the cases of alexithymia that you're talking about, so people who, I mean, I think there's a real question here about whether they just don't feel emotions, but they certainly have often significantly muted emotional responses and emotional experiences. And both philosophically and sort of in the world of emotion science, these turn out to be really interesting cases because, like, on the science side, they can help us think about what parts of the brain or parts of our physiology are involved in our emotional experiences, or at least the conscious manifestation of our emotional experiences. And then on the philosophical side, these cases turn out to be really interesting because they help us better understand like the good stuff that our emotions can do. So some of these alexithymia patients, right? Well, it might have like a really muted or a sense of fear. And then when we look at these individuals, the fearless, what we find out is that they have pretty unfortunate lives in the sense that like they're the folks that because they don't feel fear will wander down the dark alley in the middle of the night and then lo and behold get mugged. So these are people who like get mugged a lot, they get robbed a lot. Unfortunate things seem to happen for them because their emotions aren't engaging and helping them better appreciate the situations that they're in. And so, you know, if you're looking as a philosopher, as an emotion scientist for things to do research on, I think this is an awesome avenue because it's just, in some senses, underexplored, but in other ways, just like so rich in the potential payoffs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like also what is kind of reminds me is like a few years ago there was like this video floating around of someone, a patient. I think they had like I think something called congenital insensitivity to pain, where they can't feel pain, which is interesting because like pain is not only an emotion but also like a sensory experience. Right? Like we have receptors that feel pain, but it's interesting to note that there's also the muting of like emotions actually, like which you can kind of interpret emotions to not necessarily be sensory based, right? Because they're a little bit more complicated to understand, and they're relying a lot more on kind of like, I guess, or actually, I guess this is a good question. Is emotion related to consciousness? Like, is there like a conscious relation to understanding what emotion you're feeling?
So this is a central question in the philosophy of emotions about, if you're like, um, whether emotions are essentially conscious experiences. And so another way to put that is, could you have an unconscious emotion? And so classic views like James's view, they're called feeling views, and they take emotions to be particular kinds of consciously felt experiences. And if that's your view, then what emotion, whether you're experiencing emotion, and then what particular emotion you're feeling, fear, anger, anxiety, joy, pride, is going to be determined by those conscious experiences. I'm not sure that that view is right. I think that we can have unconscious emotional experiences. We can have, for instance, anxieties that shape our behavior, even though we might not be consciously aware or recognize that we're anxious. And it becomes tricky to describe exactly what's going on there. Is the emotion, in this case, the anxiety, like really not being experienced, or are we just not attending to it? Right. So you might like be working with a like a razor blade, cutting like a box cutter, and nick your finger, but be so distracted that you don't realize that you're in pain and bleeding. And then when you look at it, it starts throbbing and you feel it. So that would be a case where like you probably are feeling pain, but you're just not attending to the pain. And so then they're deep and difficult questions about whether emotions are like that. We're actually feeling it, but not at the time at least paying attention.
So I'm curious, actually, just because like the way you're kind of explaining that, it reminded me a lot of, I took AP psychology this year, so like this is probably just because it's fresh off my mind, but like Freudian psychoanalysis has a lot about like the unconscious, right? So is there any exploration of like the psychoanalysis in the theory of like emotions, or is that just not something that's been explored? But like still, there's this understanding that there might be like an unconscious experience or unconscious emotional response or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, so the Freudian cases turn out to be some of the classic examples that, at least from the philosophical armchair, we might point to as examples of intuitively plausible cases where someone either doesn't realize that they resent their mother, or they think that they misunderstand what emotion they're feeling. They resent their mother, but they think it's just fear or whatever. So those turn out to be really sort of important cases, and there's sort of conceptual questions about whether thinking about unconscious emotions is like thinking about round squares. Like they're just not possible. They betray some sort of like conceptual confusion if you think they're emotional unconscious emotions, or is there something to that? And if there is, um, can we study it empirically? And there's some interesting work suggesting that we might be able to do that, but the empirical work is tricky because it relies on these philosophical ideas about what emotions are, and so you have to make some philosophical bets and assumptions in order to sort of get those experiments up and going.
So I guess like this is a perfect opportunity to kind of talk about like what's necessary about this philosophical investigation of emotion as opposed to other forms of inquiry like that we might find in other disciplines. This is something that you wrote in a book, and I'm just curious about why that's necessary inside of this field.
Good. So, I mean, I take your question, Saurish, to be sort of a question about like what's distinctive about a philosophical investigation of emotions compared to what a developmental psychologist or an English the scholar might be doing. And I think a big part of that answer, or two things to focus on here. One, like the main difference is going to be in the sort of the set of research tools that we use to explore and understand emotions. So the central tool that we as philosophers are going to be using to think about and study emotions are going to be the tools of conceptual analysis. So thinking about, for instance, whether unconscious emotions are possible, trying to come up with examples where they seem possible or counterexamples where it seems to be just a confusion. That's going to contrast with, what the developmental psychologist is going to be doing. And they're going to be trying to figure out by looking at infants and toddlers and children, sort of what the time course is on the development of emotions in humans or maybe in non-human primates. And that's going to then, so that's going to be a largely empirical project where we have some idea what the emotions are, and then we're trying to figure out like what would be a facial expression or a body posture that we could point to as evidence that the child now has an experience of fear or pride or whatever. And then, and say something like English, it's going to be yet another toolkit where we're trying to think about sort of like emotion themes that might shape narratives in a particular work of fiction, be it, Beloved or, Moby Dick or whatever.
Okay, that's awesome. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I think I've heard from a lot of, past people who I've talked to in the past, they kind of mentioned that philosophy is kind of, I guess, not regarded to the highest level in certain fields. So, for example, like in legal epistemology, right? Like legal epistemologists do a lot of research on like how how like specific cases work and how the human is like able to navigate the specific cases, but yet they're not necessarily always included in the discussions about legal reform. Is the same thing happening here in emotional research, where there's like maybe the empirical scientists are doing a lot of all of these things and making these theories without really going to philosophers to talk about their research and how that could kind of help in the more scientific realm?
Yeah. So I guess emotion research might be a place where philosophy is working more significantly and intimately with the empirical sciences. So you will definitely find emotion scientists that are very knowledgeable. I would say most emotion scientists are pretty darn knowledgeable about at least the big brushstrokes, philosophical views about what emotions are, and those are shaping and coloring in interesting and important ways how they do their research. And similarly, I mean, it's a two-way street because the philosophers, people like me in particular, as an example, are also paying attention to what the emotion scientists are doing as we try and think about how we might get more evidence to support our theories. And similarly, I mean, I think it's not just philosophy and science, but I think that philosophy can engage with other humanistic disciplines like literature. I think literature provides some really amazing examples of just the lived experience of our emotions. And so you'll often see philosophers using passages from novels to try and give us just concrete examples of like a particularly interesting or acute or challenging emotional experience. And then the philosophical project is to try and understand what exactly is going on in those cases.
Dang, I hear that makes a lot of sense, especially like kind of the way is in which I guess like novels portray specific events can be very, very emotional for sure. So I can definitely see how that can be utilized. And you talk a lot about kind of how science can provide evidence to support your theory, and I guess also vice versa, because you talk about like these philosophical bets that these researchers have to make. But what necessarily makes a good theory of emotion? Because there's a lot to unpack here, right? Like it's very, very central to kind of how we interact as people. So how do you make a good emotional or a theory of emotion?
Yeah, I think that's another excellent question. I mean, the way that I think about it is that a philosophical theory is trying to do a bunch of stuff. It's trying to bring some unity and theoretical coherence to a bunch of different pre-theoretical intuitions that we might have about what emotions are and how they shape us and how we might shape them. So we'd want a good theory of emotion, philosophical theory of emotion, to fit well with what emotion science tells us about physiological changes or attentional shifts that characterize particular emotions. We'd want a philosophical theory to also fit with our ideas about how emotions shape our thought patterns. Some of that might be empirical, some of it might be more theoretical. So one contemporary debate is whether emotions can serve as sources of justification. So I see the dog, I'm afraid of the dog. Is my fear evidence that the dog is dangerous? Or is it just sort of something that results from a belief that the dog is dangerous? So to, which is the cart before the horse is kind of a way to maybe think about that. We might also want a good philosophical theory to help us understand like the role that emotions play in our understanding of what virtue is and what responsibility amounts to. And so, for instance, Aristotle thinks that being virtuous is having your emotions harmoniously attuned to acting in the right way. To exhibit the virtue of benevolence, I need to not only help somebody in need, but do so from a feeling of sympathy for their situation. And it's only once my emotions are sort of in line in that way that we're really getting true virtue. Others have different views about what emotions are. So, like the Stoics think that emotions are opposed to being virtuous. And so there are things that we need to get rid of. Another sort of interesting case that's both like you brought up some like legal epistemology that's like in the law, it's in epistemology, it's in value theory, it's in the science is what to make of psychopaths. So one way of understanding the what's wrong with psychopaths is that they lack emotional experiences, and it's this lack of emotional experience that keeps them from understanding in the right kinds of way what's right and wrong, good and bad. And if you buy into that view, it's controversial, but if you buy into that view, then psychopaths don't really count as moral or legal agents. They're not people who we can appropriately hold responsible for the bad things that they do, because they just don't have the conceptual equipment to understand and distinguish right and wrong.
Okay, interesting. That's like definitely, I mean, I would definitely say that's very controversial just from like first hearing about it. Like it sounds like it's definitely controversial.
Yes.
I think like it's interesting to note that like, like how Aristotle had like these virtues and like what it means to be virtuous in the context of emotional responses and how your emotions need to be like in line kind of with what is maybe right or wrong, right? And I think like, you know, and I guess I wanted to ask you, like in terms of emotional research, is there like let's say we're defining between two different emotions, let's say like pride and greed, definitely not similar at all, but like let's say we're defining the lines between them, right? Um, each person is different and each emotional response that we have is different. So how does emotional theory or like how does your like a theory for emotion kind of conceptualize that when each level of, whatever we're feeling can be different for each person?
Yeah, so some people are going to say there's no real sort of no significant uniformity to emotions within a person or across individuals. There's sort of states that we sort of construct in the moment and that shape our behavior in interesting ways, but that, across time, across individuals, there's not a whole lot of sort of deep significance that we can say about that's anger that Bob and Joe were feeling but Sally wasn't feeling, or Charlie's always angry. Those sorts of ways of speaking would be more sort of heuristical or gestures. More typically though, what philosophers think, and emotion scientists I think as well, they think that there is something that is distinctive of our particular emotions, and that is shared when you feel anger and I feel anger. What then becomes really controversial is what that shared element is. Is it a distinctive kind of physiological state? Is it a distinctive kind of cognitive state, like a belief or a judgment? Is it a distinctive kind of sort of perceptually seeing the world? Those would be various ways that philosophers have tried to understand what emotions are and what's distinctive of particular emotions.
So, like, I guess, to take this to an example, let's say there's a room and there's like some sort of video in that room, and there's maybe 10 people watching that same video, and nine of them feel angry after it, but one of them feels sad about it after watching the video. Now, do we characterize that person to have maybe like a different, like maybe like a not unnormal or non-normal or unique response to that video? Is that like a label that we can give, or is it just like this is kind of like some sort of I guess like large space of potential negative emotions, if you want to classify it as negative emotions, could be either. That's also probably controversial. But like, let's say there's like this like cloud of like negative emotions, and anger and sadness are underneath those. Do we just say that like, okay, this could potentially lead to any of these possible emotions, or do we say that like, no, this person is weird for thinking that it's a sad response or having a sad response?
So I think we need to know a little bit more about the case. So I'll try and flesh out two different versions of the nice example that you gave. So in one case, there's nothing amiss with a person who feels sad. Maybe their background or what they've been going through recently in their life just makes them more sensitive to certain things that are going on in that film clip that the other nine aren't sensitive to. So while you're focusing and I'm focusing on the bad deeds being done, and so feel angry, this person might be focusing on the victim and so feeling sad. All right, and so it's just a difference in what they're being focused on, and then that then drives the emotions experience. So nothing weird going on. A harder case to make sense of is a case where we have some reason to believe that all the people are focusing on the same stuff. Say we go a little bit further and say that the physiological responses are, identical or highly similar, but then nine say it's anger and one person says it's sadness. That's going to be a harder kind of case to make sense of. And depending on what your theory of emotion is, you're going to say that this person is making a mistake, or you're going to say, no, it's, so if you think that emotions are sort of hardwired physiological reactions, then you're going to say that this one person is mistaken, or their emotions are not functioning properly or something like that. If instead you think like emotions are things that we sort of construct in our minds, that was the kind of the first example I used a few minutes ago, then you're going to say, no, like, this person, the physiological states are going to be highly similar, but the person is just sort of interpreting their physiological changes in that situation in a different way. And, everybody's right here. So Lisa Feldman Barrett is a contemporary emotion researcher who's probably, the most prominent defender of that kind of view right now.
Okay, definitely. I mean, that makes sense. And I guess there can obviously, in any sort of case, there's going to be two sides to it. I think like that's just the beauty of philosophy. There's always two sides to everything. See, like I want to move on kind of now from emotions to talking about anxiety. So you have this book called The Anxious Mind, and in it you define a model for anxiety. What does it mean for anxiety to be a biocognitive emotion?
Good. So that's sort of my like technical philosophy speak for trying to understand. I mean, we talked about it a little bit early at the beginning of the section. There's this this idea that some emotions might be hardwired, some emotion like fear or anger, and others like nostalgia or grief might be products of our culture. But then there might be things like anxiety that are sort of combinations or mashups of the two. And so in saying that anxiety is a biocognitive emotion, what I'm trying to say is like, look, there's a hardwired core. Like anxiety at its like essence is a hardwired sensitivity to uncertainty. So we feel anxious when there's something that we care about or are trying to do, but we're uncertain about how exactly that's going to work out. And then the cultural dimension, the cognitive part of the biocognitive, is trying to capture the idea that your lived experiences and my lived experiences and other people's lived experiences are going to make us more anxious about certain things. If I was brought up in an environment where I was constantly being punished, but it was sort of capricious, I never knew like when I would be punished or why, then I might be really anxious about social criticism in a way that you who had a more typical upbringing wouldn't be. And then we might also see variations in across cultures in the sorts of things that we're anxious by, and how, when we're anxious, we end up behaving. Do we withdraw? Do we ruminate a lot? What exactly do we do? And so the idea of the biocognitive model is that anxiety is a product of both of these two dimensions, the experiences and the hardwired biological stuff.
Okay, I mean that definitely makes sense, and I mean I guess just like from me while you're talking, I was kind of thinking of like maybe personal experiences that I've had, kind of like when I was anxious about certain things. You can definitely see how those two things like come into play, and like it's a really a mixed field that we're talking about. So it definitely makes sense to label that as like biocognitive in that sense. But I want to talk about kind of like the effects of that biocognitive, understanding of emotion, right? So we know the negative effects that happen from anxiety, that's always talked about, and how there's a lot of bad things that can potentially happen from it, or different feelings can happen as well. But what are some of the positive effects of anxiety?
Good. So as I think about anxiety, as I said, it's sort of a sensitivity to problematic uncertainty. There's a threat that we're uncertain about, or we've got a challenge that we're uncertain about how exactly to deal with it. And when we're anxious, what it seems like we're doing at sort of like the most general level is we try and minimize the risk that we're being exposed to, and we try and learn more about the risky situation that we're in. And so then now we can start to see how anxiety might be beneficial. It sensitizes us to uncertain risks and gets us to sort of like try and protect ourselves. And I think that can turn out to be sort of really beneficial. So like kind of a hokey example, like you and I have just met, we're at a dinner party or something together. You and I are chatting, and I make some like comments about like politics or something like that. And I notice your facial expression changes, right? You go from having a smile to a little bit of a kind of look, right? And so like I recognize that, and now I start to get anxious. Whoa, did I like say something odd, and now I might be a little bit more deferential to you. And that's a way of sort of like getting our conversation back on track, sort of greasing the wheels of social interaction, right? So that would be sort of a hokey way that anxiety, but familiar anxiety can be beneficial. If we want to look at more sort of significant cases, we can think, I mean, there's some really cool historical examples. So the suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton was really anxious about getting married. And the reason why she was anxious about getting married is that, well, she was one of the leading suffragists at the time, advocating for women's rights. But also at the time, the institution of marriage was sort of legally and culturally something where women were submitting legally and socially to the domination of a man, right? And so she was wrestling, like, how can I get married to this man I love, but also do so in a way that doesn't sort of implicitly or explicitly sanction this institution, marriage, that I'm, as a suffragist, opposed to. And that made her really anxious. And at one point, she called off her marriage because she was so bothered by it. But so that's sort of like risk minimization. Like, I don't want to engage in this. But she also talked to her sister and her friends and her husband, her fiance, about the predicament she was in. And she came to see that there were certain ways that she could structure the marriage with her fiance so that her needs and values as a suffragist could be meshed with her needs and values as an individual, and a partner and a life partner with her husband. So that would be another example where like anxiety is making Stanton sensitive to this problem, this uncertainty. Like, how do I reconcile my competing values here? And then helping her work through those in productive ways. Now, anxiety isn't always going to work out that way. Like, as you noted, like it can misfire, it can get the better of us in all kinds of ways. But if we think we can shape anxiety for the better, and if we think it's, at least sometimes working to help us, then we can have faith that these kinds of examples, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton examples, are going to be sort of a window onto the benefits that anxiety can bring.
That's interesting because like especially because like it seems that if we have a mindset shift to kind of like interpreting how emotions or like specifically anxiety can not only, I mean, obviously it can have bad effects, but like thinking about how it could potentially have good effects, right? Like for example, we've all heard it with like stress. Stress is like something that people always say, oh, like let's like think about the good side of stress. In the same scenario, I guess you can also apply this kind of to anxiety. And there's a question later about kind of like the relationship between those terms because they're always, conflated. But I want to ask specifically about, some students or about like the student lifestyle, right? And how that relates to anxiety. How does the environment that students are placed in or school or, the constant, pressure of like being competitive or whatnot, whatever there might be, create or cultivate an anxiety? And then do you think students face more anxiety now than maybe in prior years? And also, just basically with recent events, the Uvalde tragedy that happened, could that create more anxiety for students within their school?
Good. So, I mean, there's one more, I mean, related to this. I mean, I think what is central to anxiety's value is that it's this thing that sort of like when we're operating kind of on autopilot, wakes us up and helps us see like, whoa, this is a problematic situation and I need to pay closer attention. So I think that that's sort of like one of the cool things and important things that anxiety can do. But as your question suggests, like that feature of anxiety, that mechanism can be hijacked in problematic ways. And so, I mean, so the question of like students' life, I think there are a couple of ways in which the life of students today is more complicated and anxiety inviting than the ways it was maybe when I was in school. So one is just social media, right? I mean, I think the greatest way to reduce your anxiety is to smash yourself up. If you if you get yourself off social media, your anxiety levels will go down significantly. That's a prediction that I'm very comfortable with. But like the larger point here is that like technologies of various sorts, but social media in particular, are ways of increasing uncertainty. What is my friend doing? What is the cool thing? Who's going to the party? Right? And because of that uncertainty, we become more anxious because we're uncertain about things that we care about. And so we become more anxious. So that's one dimension of what's going on here. I think also that maybe this isn't different from when I was in school than compared to when you're in school, but it's at least more at the surface. I think that educational institutions and teachers are under-equipped to provide students with the resources and the space they need to sort of appreciate emotions and the emotions that they're feeling. So like, there's a vocabulary that we need to have, understanding, you know, like that when I feel bad, that's a really sort of generic claim. I feel bad. Do I feel angry? Do I feel anxious? Do I feel sad? Right? There are all sorts of ways of feeling bad, but if we don't have sort of the conceptual resources to make those distinctions, then it's going to be really hard for us to understand what this negative yuck is and what then to do with it. And I think one of the things that teachers and educational resources can do, but unfortunately don't do often enough, is help provide students with the conceptual resources to sort of understand the emotions that they feel. But that's only part of it, because we, students and non-students alike, need the space and the sort of freedom to sort of work through the emotions that we're experiencing. And so if we don't have that either, then there's also going to be like inadequate resources for just understanding. And like, if there's a difference here between when I was in school and nowadays, it's just that the curriculum has just gotten so much more full, right? You know, like there's the standardized test coming up, and gosh darn it, we gotta get you, you know, through the multiplication tables or whatever, so that you can ace it. And because of that, because there's so much that's required to be done, there's less space for sort of like just sitting in your emotions and trying to figure out, like, you know, should I really be angry? Was that really something to be proud of? You know, that kind of stuff.
Oh, that definitely makes sense. And I guess
Did I
like I
answer all
also
that
kind of
question? I'm not sure I did.
I think you know, there's one question that I'm still like waiting on, but that will be answered in the next question because it kind of like works together.
Right.
So you know, my next question is kind of about like, so there's a psychiatrist named Carl Jung. I believe that's how pronounced, and then he introduced kind of this concept of the collective unconscious, and this is in like Freudian psychoanalysis theory. So I'm curious if there's like this understanding of like the collective anxiety. I mean, does that exist, and what could it potentially look like? And the thing that instantly comes to mind, and you know, I mentioned this in the past question, was the Uvalde tragedy that
Right.
happened, because that had a emotional response, I think, for a lot of students, including me personally, just about the state of our safety in school. So how could that, you know, maybe contribute to a theory of collective anxiety?
Good. So I was just at an emotions conference, and one of the sort of like sets of discussions that were going on at the conference was discussions about what are called political emotions, right? And these would be emotions that groups of individuals, citizens, are going to be experiencing as a group, in large part because of a shared set of values and you know, a shared situation, right? So you know, feminists and Democrats might be anxious about whether Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. We might understand that as a collective or a political emotion, in the sense that there's a set of shared values there about the importance of women's reproductive rights and choices. There's a shared context about the leaked opinion that is now giving shape to this anxiety. Similarly, in the case of gun violence, students, among others, have a shared set of values and safety and the freedom to engage in school and non-school settings without fear of horrific violence. But then, there's a set of situations where sort of repeatedly the structures that are needed to sort of allow those values to flourish is compromised. And so again, there's this uncertainty about whether my values, my concern, my desire to have sort of a non-trauma involving education is going to be realized. And so we might have a collective anxiety as students or as citizens in the United States that brings rise to this anxiety, and that's going to not be found in places where the context is different, and countries where there isn't, where guns aren't as prevalent, where gun violence isn't as prevalent. That would just predict that you're not going to have these particular anxieties.
Yeah, and I think also like just the understanding of like global warming, I think has a lot of anxiety, and that could be for maybe everyone in the globe, not just specifically us in America. I do have like just two more quick questions, kind of about. So the first one is about we talked about like how there's anxiety and stress are almost always used together, and on top of that, depression, right? So what is the difference between all of these? If you could explain a little bit on that.
Good. I mean, so at one level, if it's just sort of like, us talking casually, there might not be any significant difference. These are just sort of synonyms, and, we're using them more or less interchangeably. When we start thinking about like the philosophy of emotion or emotion science or clinical psychology, these are going to become sort of technical terms with very specific meanings. So stress is going to be a term that we use to describe sort of environmental or internal forces. They might be physical forces, they might be mental or psychological forces that sort of push the system outside of its normal operating range, right? So a bridge can be stressed in this sense. Your heart can be stressed in this sense. Your psychological well-being can be stressed in this sense, right? The system, the psychological well-being, your heart, the bridge are being pushed beyond its normal operating bounds. That's stress. Anxiety then is going to be an emotion, right? It's an emotion that is tuned into uncertainty and helps or tries to help you address that uncertainty. Depression then is going to be a clinical condition, or maybe a non-clinical sort of mood. So it's not an emotion, it's more like a moody kind of thing. And here it's going to be characterized less by like uncertainty and more in terms of sort of a flattened interest in engaging, a reduced sort of set of desires to pursue the things that you have otherwise been interested in pursuing, a subdued sort of emotional or affective engagement with the people and world around you. So these will start to become very different things once we start looking at them through the lens of emotion science, philosophy of emotions.
That definitely makes sense. And I guess like for viewers who might be interested a little bit more, if you go back, I think it's episode 4, I believe, with Dr. Ian Tully, we had like a great discussion on kind of depression and specifically more on like the the distinction between the two, or between all of these terms, because especially when it comes to maybe like clinical terms like depression, there is maybe a large difference, and so there needs to be some sort of awareness and kind of learning about what those distinctions may be. So the last question that I have today is kind of relevant to our audience, and kind of about the ways in which young people who are listening and tuning in can explore the philosophy of anxiety or emotions and more, and how they can learn to control them better, or just to aid them in their life. Like, what are some of the things that we should be taking from this podcast and kind of employing in our life, or trying to learn more at least?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most significant things, and we touched on it, a little bit earlier, is just enriching our emotion vocabulary and enriching our understanding of what these emotions are. I mean, I think that that's a huge first step. And so, like, how do you do that? Well, I think like there's, if you're familiar with the online magazine Aeon, AEON dot UK, I think. I can send you a link for it and you can include it. But it's an online magazine where philosophers, psychologists, academics talk about all sorts of stuff, but a huge chunk of what these articles do, and they're like 1,000 to 3,000 words, so they're short, is talk about emotions. So there's, I have a piece in there on anxiety. A philosopher named Sarah Patowski has a really interesting one on jealousy. Martha Nussbaum has a super interesting one on anger. Simon Blackburn, another one on pride. And so these are just sort of ways to sort of engage with the empirical stuff, with the philosophical stuff, and get a deeper appreciation for the nasty and the beneficial side of our emotions. And I think that that would be sort of a great sort of entryway into thinking more seriously and sophisticatedly about emotions.
Definitely. And I think also like just becoming more empathetic in general and trying to understand is also like a general trend that can be really beneficial, especially like in times right now where it seems like almost everything is along the lines of like cancel culture almost, where it's like you can't really make a statement or try to learn even. So it's like just kind of understanding those things, and how the world, it kind of plays into how other people are feeling at certain moments, is really, really beneficial in our everyday lives. That about wraps up our discussion today. Thank you so much, Dr. Professor Kurth, can like joining in and like talking about emotions. Like, I know it's like it's something that happens every single day. Everyone feels it. Well, I mean, we had a case where maybe there isn't mitigated, but at least definitely some sort of emotional response. And so it really, really helped me a lot in just learning how I can also be more empathetic and learn more about emotions in general. And I'm sure our audience learned a lot as well.
Awesome. If emotions are cool, this podcast is even cooler. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of the conversation. It's really been enjoyable.
Of course. Thank you so much.